I think one of the horrors of our society, American society, maybe it's true of others, but I know of this country, is this break with the past, a lack of continuity. Young people know nothing of the past. For that matter, even people who lived in the past have forgotten it. And I think the New Deal on the arts project is a good case in point. It's as though it never existed. Not even in history books, but not in memories of people.
The 21st of October, 1920 dime. It was not just variety that gave the market crash a bad notice. Many had idolized Herbert Hoover. Only a year before, he had said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." By 1931, 12 million Americans were out of work and farm prices hit bottom. The Bonus Army. Thousands of angry World War I veterans marched on Washington, and many spoke openly of revolution. Federal troops under General MacArthur attacked the veterans. Still undaunted, Hoover kept telling the country that prosperity was just around the corner.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
In 1932, the hero of the hour arrived, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The popular governor of New York would be president of the United States for the next 13 years. He brought new enthusiasm, a new deal.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Roosevelt didn't offer only rhetoric. He offered realities. The New Deal provided jobs for close to 1/3 of the nation's labor force. Public works like highways, dams, parks, and public housing. These projects also had a larger purpose. The New Deal promised to restore meaning to the lives of millions. The WPA did not just help workers. It also put unemployed artists to work. Jobs were created for thousands of musicians, painters, actors, dancers, and photographers. For $23.86 a week, the standard WPA compensation, they gave the country an unprecedented artistic renaissance.
The New Deal had this wonderful idea, not just about theater, it extended to all professions, that it was better to take people off the relief rolls, let's say, to give them a small check each week to keep them alive. It would, rather than do that, it was better to put them to work, even though receiving the same amount of money, and give them some self-respect that they were earning this money instead of just receiving it as charity.
In the performing arts, jobs were provided for playwrights, directors, and actors by the Federal Theater Project. The Federal Writers Project sent hundreds of writers to talk to people all over the country. They found a vision of a better world in the lives of ordinary people.
It gave the writer a sense of his own country and of his immediate environment. He had to explore that environment in order to produce the books that the Writers Project was preparing.
You went to the small towns and called a meeting in the city hall and asked them what their history was, which no one had ever asked them before, probably ever. I mean, what is your history? And they came in hordes to tell us.
Such experiences were not only recorded by writers, but also by some of the country's leading photographers. They were hired by the Farm Security Administration to visually document the devastating effects of the Depression on rural America.
There were some of us, including President Roosevelt, who realized that we were passing through a time which we hoped would never be repeated in American history. And to have a record of it seemed very important at the time.
There was a need to produce a collection of photographs that would show the American people the terrible conditions under which farm people lived, the rural poverty, the migrant labor conditions, the environmental problems such as the Dust Bowl and the great drought that took place in those years, and the general effects of the Great Depression. And there was a need to explain these problems as well as to justify the programs that Roosevelt and Tugwell had developed to alleviate these situations.
Before the 30s, the United States was an unknown island so far as art is concerned. Certainly we had the 8. We had a rather nice tradition of early American art, but it was not a world shaker. And after the 30s, just because every Tom, Dick, and Harry was able to make a good or a bad painting, and so many people got their training, so many different points of view were encouraged. They didn't ask whether you painted this way or whether you painted that way. They asked whether you needed help or wanted help.
Murals, posters, and paintings by thousands of New Deal artists were mounted in public buildings and public places. In the past, artists have been patronized by kings, bishops, and wealthy individuals. In this country, too, the arts had to rely on private benefactors. Government sponsorship of the arts in the 30s was a unique experiment in American history. Of course, government sponsorship has its shortcomings. Often the bureaucracy may feel entitled to its own ideas about art, and sometimes artists believe that they should only convey social and political messages. In both cases, art can become boring and propagandistic. When government sponsors the arts, success or failure largely depends on the individual administrators involved. WPA appointments were good ones. Most often than not, administrators took the artist's side and, thank God, protected them from government interference. The Federal Theater was led by an energetic young woman, Hallie Flanagan. She had been director of the theater workshop at Vassar College and was well known as the author of a travel report on her experience with the avant-garde theaters in Europe and in the Soviet Union. She was concerned with new forms of theater and with reaching audiences who had never seen live theater before.
It was the first time, and in many ways the only time, that I knew of a federally sponsored theater that regarded theater as a communication and therefore a social responsibility.
Oh, they're having a book burning on the green tomorrow night. A what? Gonna burn up all this subversive literature. A lot of smutty stuff that's crumping public morals. Have you got any objections?
Well, you won't find any subversive books here.
Oh. Now, how about this fellow? Now, this fellow, Charles Dickens, wasn't he a communist?
The line that I always quote, because I think it's the best line that's ever been written on the subject, was from Brecht's Galileo, when he said, a man cannot unsee what he's seen. And a lot of people with a very strong morality of some sort, which was inculcated and a part of a tradition, saw things in the late 20s and the early 30s that they could not unsee.
One of the things the Federal Theater people could not unsee was the plight of minorities in American society. For the first time in American history, the Federal Theater offered black actors real opportunities. The first plays by and for blacks were done in Harlem at the new Lafayette Theater under the direction of the actress Rose McLandon and the young producer John Houseman.
The question was, what kind of, just artistically, what kind of shows should you do? Because there were those who said we should go back and do the old stock company thing of using black actors to play in successful white plays, I was against that, and the community generally had turned now to being against that sort of thing. There were those who had great ambitions for the theater. There were those who felt the theater should concern itself entirely with contemporary and indigenous problems and so on. I did a lot of thinking and talking with a lot of people, and I finally came to the decision, with this advice that I got, that the only way to run it was to cut the theater into two halves.
One group was formed to produce dramas of contemporary black life. It was led by Carlton Moss.
Well, we opened that theater with the Federal Theater, the Lafayette section, the Lafayette Theater, with Walk Together Children, which, as I said, was a play that did not challenge the status quo. It was based on the scripture, the meek shall inherit the earth. That was its message, that eventually the bad people can be persuaded to be good people if everybody follows the scripture.
Then, simultaneously with this, but it took longer to get going, we decided that we would treat the black actor simply as an actor, and that we would do great plays. We would do classics, we would do any kind of play we wanted, and we would simply not admit that there was any question of color one way or the other. And obviously the first playwright with whom one should try this experiment is obviously William Shakespeare. I'd formed a great friendship with Orson Welles, who was then only 19 years old, but I had this total conviction that he was a genius. I asked him to try his hand at directing a Shakespearean play with black actors, and he was enormously enthusiastic. And immediately the parallel between Macbeth in Scotland in the 13th century and the history of Christophe in Haiti, which was again the rise of a soldier who becomes a dictator and finally ends in a bloodbath. That seemed a very interesting and close parallel.
Arm and out! There is no flying head, no tearing here. I begin to be weary of the sun, and with the estate of the world were now undone. Ring the alarm bell! Ring! Come, Rex! At least we'll die with harness on our backs. What's he that was not born of woman? Such a one am I, to fear or none. Let me find him fortune. Tyrant, show thy face. I cannot fight a wretched turn, whose arms are higher to bear the stairs. If thou beest slain and with no stroke of mine, my wife and children's ghosts will haunt thee still. What is thy name? My name's Macbeth. Lay on, Macduff. Let them be he who first cries, hold enough.
Our position was that we should get into that theater a cross-section or get the largest possible audience, and in order to do that, you had to go to where most people were. And I remember in the opening of Macbeth, we went to the Elks, which is a fraternal organization, and made an arrangement with them to supply a band for us. Then we went to the city and we got a permit, and we had a parade. I had a crew of about 8 people who plastered the town with placards, and we used to write on the sidewalk, on the corner. Then we visited every church in the community, so we got the clergymen involved. We began to get sellout audiences. These were solid black audiences. Then you had, of course, you had all of these people coming from downtown, white people who had been attracted by exotic quality.
From his mother's womb, untimely ripped. Accursed be the tongue that tells me so. And be these juggling fiends no more believing. Hail King! Behold, where stands the usurper's cursed head. The time is free! All hail Malcolm! Peace! The charm wound up!
The most significant thing about the Federal Theater, particularly the Harlem section of it, was that it gave for the first time in the history of the American theater black technicians an opportunity to get experience, and it broke the anti-black stronghold that the stage hand union had.
All the arts suddenly became available to a vast audience. It was the beginning of a truly popular culture. Stage productions toured the country, actors played in high schools, public libraries, in tents, and on truck platforms. The WPA encouraged painters to seek public places for their work. Artists used to brush, canvas, and easel received instruction in mural painting techniques, and soon large tableaus sprang up in court buildings, post offices, and libraries. One of the leading painters on the Chicago Arts Project was Aaron Borrett.
I guess my own inclinations were to go to ordinary subject matter and an effort to come up with an aesthetic result on the basis of everyday life, unglamorous life. Went into every nook and cranny of the city of Chicago for the materials that I was interested in getting. This is a South State Street subject that I did in the city, of the storefronts and of the characters walking back and forth in the atmosphere there. The American artist was finally looking at his own country for his subject matter, whereas formerly it was the business of the talented young American painter going to Paris, not only for his tutelage, but for his subject matter, so that he came back and he painted some pretty impressionist paintings modeled after sturdier models. But here, the American artist was looking at ramshackle red barns at city streets, which were either tumbled down or reasonably sturdy. But in any case, at his own country, his own city, his own backyard.
The post office lobby became the main stage for the rediscovery of populist traditions. Particularly in the Middle and Southwest, this led to the creation of a new realism. It recorded the history of regions whose spirit had never before been expressed artistically. Gallup, New Mexico is a small town near the Navajo reservation. Before 1935, Gallup never had paintings, and the Navajo, not to mention Navajo painters, had no way to make their views known. Now Gallup's library has an impressive collection of works by important painters of the Southwest, most of them Native Americans.
Now, I regard this as probably the most exciting painting of all, and this is done by Harrison Begay. This is the famous Yebi Chai, the dance, the 9-day dance, where women and men dance.
Harrison Begay is one of the most important Navajo painters. His career as a painter began with the Federal Arts Project.
My style of painting changed very little. I follow the old traditional Indian painting mostly, although sometimes I do other kind of paintings. This is the painting I do. It's an everyday life of my people. But most of the demands by my people are these old traditional painting with designs, different kind of legendary design, traditional symbolic designs. That's what I do most of them.
In the 30s, most of the Indian painters created their finest work, unimpeded by financial pressures and commercial considerations. They could follow their own dictates rather than work for the trading post and curio shops. The leading Navajo muralist, today an arts teacher at an Indian school, was Andrew Senagini.
Well, we were in a group, you know, the Indian artists were in a group, and we work at a certain place, you know, like Oklahoma and Tulsa. I was trained to do the mural job, large scale. I had a helper, you know, some boys to help me to put up some large murals. Scaffolding, and I painted some murals in Phoenix, Arizona, and administration building.
To give a voice to the voiceless, either by encouraging them to speak for themselves or by calling attention to their plight, this could be the motto for all New Deal art. The voiceless, the deprived, included farmers, especially in the Midwest. They had fallen victim to sandstorms and droughts. Many had lost their property and their work. Few across the country could grasp the catastrophe that had occurred. To understand and cope with the situation, Roosevelt and his Secretary for Agriculture, Henry Wallace, created a special division within the Department of Agriculture, the Resettlement Administration, later called the Farm Security Administration, FSA. It was headed by one of Roosevelt's intellectual advisors, the young Columbia University economics professor, Rexford Guy Tugwell.
This was a peculiar time when agriculture was changing. Not only was there a depression, but the techniques of agriculture were changing. The cotton picker was just coming into use, and this meant that a great many people in the South, sharecroppers and others, had their jobs taken away from them, and there began this terrible movement to the cities.
Tugwell understood that the suffering of the farmers had to be publicized to the country, and photographs seemed to be the best medium. During his days at Columbia, he had published the first economics textbook to use photographs as illustrations. The pictures for this book had been assembled by his assistant, Roy Stryker. Tugwell now hired him to head the FSA photography section.
So when I went to Washington and took charge of this work that we were doing in the Department of Agriculture and then the Resettlement Administration, it seemed quite natural to me to send for Roy and tell him that he was the kind of person we needed to make a visual record of what was being done. And besides, to make a historic record of what the times were like, because the times were very bad.
There was only one major record of the catastrophe in American agriculture. It was accompanied by an extraordinary collection of photographs, something unheard of at the time. It was written by a young economist from California, Paul Schuster Taylor.
Well, why did I want a photographer? I said, because the conditions that I see in the field are the conditions that need to be remedied. And the only way that I can show the people who make the decisions in the cities what the conditions and the needs are is by showing them photographs to supplement my analysis.
The young photographer who traveled with Taylor and whom he later married was Dorothea Lange. Her work revealed both her political commitment and her acute powers of observation, qualities Tugwell and Stryker were looking for, and Dorothea Lange was hired as the first FSA photographer.
When the farmer comes to town with his wagon broken down, oh, the farmer is the man that feeds them all. If you'll only look and see, I think you will agree that the farmer is the man that feeds them all. The farmer is the man, the farmer is the man. He lives on credit till the fall. Then they take him by the hand, then they lead him through the land, and the merchant, he's the one that gets it all.
While Lang tried to capture people in motion with small cameras, the second photographer Stryker hired preferred the large plate camera and the tripod. Walker Evans was already acknowledged as one of the great photographic artists of the time when he joined FSA. Evans refused any touch of the exotic. His photos never deprived people or things of their dignity. He never degraded a subject into a mere illustration. Ben Shahn, the next photographer to join FSA, was already famous at the time as a painter. His wife, Bernarda Bryson Shahn, remembers why he took up photography.
Once it is made into a work of art, becomes a symbolic thing. In other words, becomes the universal. And he had a very strong feeling about that. And particularly in the days when he was using a camera, he had a very strong feeling of the importance of specific things.
Three things left their mark on FSA photographs. Dorothy Lang's precise sense of the moment of highest intensity. Walker Evans's great respect for the dignity of human beings and objects. And Ben Shahn's conviction of the meaning of details seen in the right context. These techniques were extensively practiced by the younger photographers Stryker hired. Among them was Arthur Rothstein, who during the 30s shot over 50,000 photographs for FSA before going on to become chief photographer for Look magazine.
The type of photography that we did, whether we did it consciously or unconsciously, could be called a social documentary type of photograph. And that type of photograph, to my way of thinking, is characterized by the selection of significant details which comment on the relationship between people and their environments, and significant details which make the photograph more meaningful than just a mere record of the scene. See, this is from the very first assignment that I did in October 1935. The photograph is interesting not only because it shows this man with dignity reading a book. The sign on the wall, Christ is the head of this house, the silent listener to every conversation, combined with the picture of Clara Bow over here and the Colosseum over there. And from this, you get an idea, perhaps, of this man's interests. This is his home. Neat, well-organized, little lace cover for the table, and these other aspects of his environment.
Rothstein was a New Yorker. The West for him was unknown territory, strange at times, surprising and exotic. Quite the opposite holds true for painter-photographer Russell Lee. He grew up in the West and had a great commitment to its ways and people.
This is actually a picture of a family in southwestern Iowa that is eating Christmas dinner, as it so happened. This was on the first assignment that I had. This is a family of Earl Pauley. The character of the room, this cream separator. All these things are important to tell the surroundings of this particular family. Or here's a detail, very simple, of the entrance to a home. It tells quite a bit about the home there. The general disrepair. This one is in Oklahoma, and much before the days of electricity, as you can see. We had the old-fashioned washboard here, and the woman did the work, as you can well see. People at that time had very little idea of what was going on in one part of the country that they were not from. The communication was very poor. Transportation was very poor at the time. There was no television. Radio was not too prevalent. And electrification, rural electrification, was not existent.
Lee's familiarity with Westerners and their world could best be seen in his most famous work, in one of the very first picture essays, a series about a self-help community called Pie Town.
Pie Town was isolated, really. And here was a contact with the outside world. This was the post office, the gas station, and the stage job. Well, there was a woman here a long time ago who would make very good pies. It so happened that this was on the road west from Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, and many people who were displaced by the tractor or by the drought or whatever were moving to California trying to find work. And this was one place where many people had stopped, and they had begun to form a community there of these displaced people. They were farmers, and here was a chance to get some cash money right away to get established. So people in the community would welcome the newcomers. They would help them to construct their own house. The about only thing that the newcomer needed was maybe $1 to buy some nails with. There was one building in particular that was a school, it was a community hall, and it was a church. And they used it at the right time. This was a community sing, and just a detail of 3 of the ladies.
Well, most of us were familiar with the work of Louis Hine, and before that, Jacob Riis. They were sociologists with cameras, and we thought that we would follow along those same lines to be sociologically oriented with our photographs.
Jacob Riis, the Danish immigrant who wrote The Making of an American and How the Other Half Lives, was the pioneer of socially conscious documentary photography. In the late 19th century, working as a police reporter in the slums of Manhattan's steaming Lower East Side, he took his famous photos. Riis hoped they would make clear to the well-off just how necessary progressive reform was. Reform was also the goal of Louis Hine's photographs. Taking pictures of Ellis Island before the First World War, Hines found ways of arranging people and things to give him striking documentary images. He asked people to look directly at the camera, something portrait photographers in studios had deliberately tried to avoid. The social documentary, both photographic and written, was at once an historical record and a tool to change society. It was rediscovered in the 30s as the most characteristic way to express the American vision. The social documentary, with its emphasis on significant detail, became the form most widely practiced by the more than 10,000 members of the Federal Writers Project. Between 1935 and 1940, they produced over 3,000 publications, most of them dealing with local history. The major work was a series of 50 travel guidebooks to the United States. Each volume contains a social history of the state it covers. In charge of the travel guide series was the national editor of the Writers Project, Jerry Mangione.
Robert Cantwell, who strikes me as one of the most discerning of the critics of the 30s, thought that the books were extremely valuable because they presented America in a way that no one had ever seen America before. Far from being the very thrifty, sober kind of people that Americans had been considered, he found in these volumes much evidence that they were ingenuous and naive, and that they were gamblers. And for example, they would toss a coin to see where a boundary line should be, or they were sort of churlish in some respects. There were, you've heard of spite fences, where a person would put up a fence just to be hostile to his neighbors. There were also spite hotels and spite railroads, just to get even with some competitor.
The Depression hit worst in the very region which most attracted the populist-minded artists, writers, and photographers of the time, the Midwest. They felt the attitudes they found among farmers and miners would help to build a new society. These ideas are most clearly expressed by a labor journalist, feminist, poet, and novelist who was the driving force behind the Minnesota Writers Project, Meridel LeSueur.
And all of those struggles, I think the first taking over of a grocery store was in Minneapolis, where everybody just leaned against the glass and it broke, and then we all went in and took groceries. The best ham I ever had I took out of that grocery store. The Midwest is has a deep democratic populist history, because it was settled really by the Homestead Act, where an amazing thing happened that never happened in the world before, where you got 160 acres of land for simply developing it. What is little known is that in North Dakota, the people actually took over the state, actually voted in what was called a nonpartisan league. It was really for 1 year in 1918, a socialist state in the middle of the United States. And then it was smashed down in the First World War. I think that a lot of the pressure on the Roosevelt regime for relief and for the projects and the WPA projects and the CCC, it was called, came from the Middle West. In fact, many of the laws like Social Security and unemployment insurance were created in North Dakota in the nonpartisan league days.
Thus, it was the Midwestern countryside with its small towns that became the setting for the most influential novel of working-class life, The Disinherited, by Jack Conroy. Conroy, a miner's son, grew up in Moberly, a small mining town in central Missouri, and spent most of his life there.
This used to be the Wabash Railroad Station in the days when Moberly was a great railroad center. 8 trains daily came in here from all directions. Now there are no passenger trains at all. You can see the station is boarded up. The freight trains come through, but no passenger trains at all. When I think of coming back to Moberly, I think of Vachel Lindsay's lines about Springfield, Illinois. Now, people going into Springfield see nothing but a dingy little mining town. But I think of Vachel's lines about Springfield, Illinois. He said, "Let not our town be large, remembering that little Athens was the Muses' home, that Oxford ruled the heart of London still, and Florence brought the Renaissance to Rome."
Writers thought that only from such small towns as Florence, Athens, or Moberly, a genuine civilization could originate. Some anthropologists of the 1930s looked for enduring culture in primitive tribes. Conroy looked for it in Moberly. This insistence that the American small town had world importance was expressed by Conroy's publication in Moberly of 2 magazines, The Anvil, which later merged with Partisan Review, and The Rebel Poet. The Rebel Poet's manifesto outlined the mood and outlook of the writers of the period.
We champion the cause of the weak and defenseless. We combat the greed of industrial barons who are converting American laborers into abject serfs.
We ridicule the musty echoes of the fin de siècle slogan, art for art's sake, and inscribe on our banner, art for humanity's sake.
When you're asked about leaving, this is what you say. We're so darn poor and ragged, we can never get away. And it's hard times in old Coleman's mines, a hard time for boy.
I'd come back to Moberly here from Toledo, you know, scrambling around as best I could, selling some stories to the American Mercury. That kept me alive. My wife's wages working at the shoe factory for about $6 a week. And some book reviews for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. In the meantime, I'd been communicating with Nelson Algren, an old friend who had contributed to the Anvil and all that. So he got me to come up there, and I stayed in his pad until I finally got on the Chicago project.
I was just knocking around the country from 1931 to 1935. And so I was very pleased when I finally could go up to his office and get a regular check, which was about $85 a month to begin with, but I rose very rapidly to $125 a month within about 4 years' time. But it gave me leisure. That is, I could go up there at 10 in the morning and sign out at noon and say you go to the library and go to the racetrack.
The singer and dancer named Catherine Dunham, you know, is also a specialist in West Indian folklore and folk dancing and all that stuff. She was our supervisor, and she quit, and they put Arne Bontom and I on the job. Arne and I worked together out there, and we were doing a study called The Negro in Illinois.
The Negro in Illinois, later published under the title They Seek a City, was only one in a large number of studies in black history the Federal Writers Project produced. The most important were the ex-slave narratives, interviews with several hundred former slaves, of whom over 10,000 were still alive in the 30s. This concern to document local and regional history was accompanied by an equally strong interest in the great themes of American and Western civilization. One of the more successful attempts could be seen in the Bronx Post Office in New York City, the mural competition for which was won by the late Ben Shahn and his wife, Bernarda Bryson Shahn.
Probably well over 100 artists entered that competition. And it was certainly a great day for Ben when the telegram came that he had won it. And he was terribly happy. I had submitted some sketches too, and they accepted me as an assistant. If one is involved with people and with politics and with ideas, certainly he could never find a readier audience than he could in a big post office like that. And Ben chose for his theme Walt Whitman's poem, I See America Working. And so he had all of the kinds of working in the mural. And then he, on the end wall, he had Whitman and the words of the poem. And so that was the key to the whole thing. Whitman's total song his song of myself was not really a song of myself. It was a song that myself is everybody. And that I would say that would correspond to Ben's view 100%, that Ben felt his identification with people just totally.
Shahn had learned mural painting from Diego Rivera, the famous Mexican artist who came to the United States in the 30s. One of Rivera's famous murals was a dramatic rendering of the Ford assembly plant in Detroit, commissioned by Henry and Edsel Ford. New Deal artists emulated Rivera's realism. They wanted to apply his methods to early American themes and traditions. One painter who admired Rivera was George Biddle, the brother of Roosevelt's first Attorney General. A huge mural of Biddle's commands the staircase of the Justice Department in Washington. The painting quotes Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. "If we would guide by the light of reason, we must let our minds be bold." The mural vividly illuminates the reform vision of the New Deal. It shows the path of the immigrant leading from hard work and dirty sweatshops to the richly set table of the New Deal. Biddle portrayed several members of Roosevelt's first cabinet seated at the table. The Treasury employed artists and paid them a modest salary. It wasn't until 1935, under the WPA, that a program was set up specifically for the unemployed artist. The museum curator, Schulz-Keil, was appointed head of the Federal Arts Project. Keil had made a name for himself pioneering exhibitions of American folk art. He was considered a compromise candidate who could satisfy both the radical and the more academic artists of the time. Treasury Department artists worked exclusively on murals and sculptures for federal buildings, often with patriotic themes. The art project artists, thematically much less restricted, worked in many other areas. There were print shops where they prepared posters urging examinations for the eyes, the teeth, and for venereal diseases. Berenice Abbott photographed New York City for the Arts Project. Fashion designers worked in WPA workshops. WPA artists designed postage stamps and even the nickel. And they created a unique inventory of American popular art and design. Weather vanes, ship figureheads, silverware, doorknobs. This index was the pet project of folklorist Schulz-Keil. These meticulous drawings allowed hundreds of artists to practice their craft and to prepare for later careers in the applied arts. More than any other achievement, the index fulfilled the two major goals of the arts projects: to develop skills and to provide relief for the unemployed.
The New Deal did provide jobs, many such programs that have been, of course, maligned by those who hated the New Deal. Here in Chicago, the Chicago Tribune, when the leading opponents had front-page cartoons all the time, damning the New Deal. And the usual clown was the guy with the glasses, the radical professor. And generally the man leaning on the shovel was the attack on the Work Project Administration, the WPA. And so these guys are getting money for nothing.
Reds in charge of Federal Writers Project. The attacks on the WPA arts projects soon became politically charged. It was in this atmosphere of suspicion that the man who was later to become Henry Wallace's campaign manager was made state supervisor of the Illinois Writers Project. Curtis McDougal.
Well, it was a part of the entire anti-New Deal, anti-Franklin Roosevelt attempt. There was these reactionaries, the economic royalists, he called them. We've called them fascists, and
worse since, and they deserve all they were called. They did everything they could to throw obstacles in the way.
Martin Dies, a congressman from Texas, began to make a political career out of anti-New Deal sentiment. In 1938, Dies set up a committee to investigate un-American activities. Among the first called before Dies committee were the directors of the Federal Theater and the Federal Writers Project.
It was obvious to all of us that Mr. Dies and his committee were using the arts projects, especially the Writers Project and the Theater Project, as a whipping boy, as a way of attacking the New Deal. It's very easy to attack artists, much easier than, say, to attack the larger groups of WPA workers, such as construction workers and so on. So the writers and the theater people were constantly under attack.
Well, during the 3 years, more than 3 years that I was the state supervisor, probably 1,000 persons. Our project in Illinois was by far the largest in the country. New York, which gets so much of the publicity and the books and articles, had only 10% of the total population. And we had about probably 500 at a time. And of those, so many that have become very prominent since, very successful, and who, if they hadn't been kept alive during those horrible days, never would have come where they are.
Saul Bellow, the Nobel Prize winner, was involved with the project. So was Ralph Ellison, the author of The Invisible Man. Studs Terkel became famous for his collections of oral history. The poet Conrad Aiken was involved, as was Maxwell Bodenheim, already a well-known successful writer. Richard Wright was supported when he wrote his novel Native Son, probably the most important book which owes its existence to the Federal Writers Project.
All of those people were these lazy bums that worked for me on the Writers Project. People that were looked down upon and condemned by the old guard, taxpayers who resented the whole New Deal project.
All of the projects put to work skills and talents which might have stayed undeveloped. The record of the Arts Project is the most staggering. Practically without exception, every American artist born between 1900 and 1915 spent his formative years in the Arts Project. Most of their work from this time has been lost, and today we have to rely on black and white archive photographs. Willem de Kooning painted this ship's figurehead. Jackson Pollock did these harvest and factory scenes. Mark Roscoe painted this landscape. Stuart Davis did this abstract painting. Arshid Gorky did this mural. Joseph Stella painted this silo.
They were different types of people, the artists were, but at the same time, they were in warm sympathy with the efforts of people who were in trouble and people, various people, to organize.
Most New Deal art was quite unpolitical. However, some artists felt that the political message was what counted. Artists like William Gropper, at the time, tried to make a hero out of the industrial worker. Unlike the FSA photographers who showed a genuine concern for the individual, Gropper's workers seemed to have no individual identity at all. There's a vast difference between the social documentarism of the FSA photographers and the proletarian realism of some WPA painting. Social and political commitment did not necessarily mean superhuman workers. Much more subtle is Ben Shahn's portrayal of textile workers in a large mural painted for a town now called Roosevelt, New Jersey. The town, built in the 1930s, was a New Deal experiment in urban planning, with workplace and housing located together. Shahn's mural is an argument for the ideal printed on the poster. The principle of American labor, the right of every man and woman to work.
many of the artists were communist. I was a communist at that point, and the Central Committee of the Communist Party was breaking its neck to dominate what was going on, and they were giving out orders which were happily ignored because artists don't take orders.
Bernarda Bryson-Shawn was an editor of Art Front magazine. It acted as a forum for the radical artists of the time. In spite of quarrels with the Communist Party, many artists remained either members or close sympathizers. Outside their work, they submitted to the frequent shifts at the Moscow party line and supported the party's campaigns against more independent artists like Diego Rivera.
The tragedy of Rivera was that he wanted to be accepted. The dream of his life was to be thoroughly accepted by the Communist Party. But he was natively intransigent. He couldn't be controlled, and they hated him. And so anybody who worked with him, including Ben, became a target for their disapproval. And they constantly excoriated poor Rivera, who constantly sought to be accepted by them.
I attended that famed meeting in a thronged hall where Diego Rivera began his speech, which was translated by Louis Lazarick, a well-known lithographer. And his translation continued for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then he threw his hands up in disgust and an unwillingness to continue with what he called the bourgeois notions that Diego Rivera was introducing to the radical New York audience, which were members of the John Reed Club. And people began shouting and pushing and shoving, and there were characters who I got to know later, such as Jacob Burke, who was a cartoonist for the Sun-Times, who stood up in a corner and denounced Diego Rivera for every utterance he made. And principally it was based, it seemed to me, on the fact that he chose to speak in French, bourgeois French, instead of proletarian Spanish. It was just before the 1936 insurrection in Spain, of course, and that kind of fired up tempers.
It was not so much doctrinaire party communism, but an emotional solidarity with the oppressed that moved people to join the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and fight in Spain. Communism is 20th century Americanism. This inscription graced the halls of the American Communist Party headquarters.
Communist Party was a respectable party at the time. And it's a difficult question now. You say, were you a communist? Of course, everybody who had any grain of knowledge of what was going on was a communist. The only trouble is the climate of the word, the connotation of the word was something quite different now.
There was a law, it was mandatory that when people were hired on these projects, there was to be no questioning of their political affiliation. The Republicans insisted on that provision because they were afraid that they would be left out.
Paradoxically, there were many on the left who had moral difficulties with joining projects sponsored by the government and designed perhaps to co-opt radicals into the reformist camp. One such critic was the Writers' Project nature editor, the poet Kenneth Rexroth.
Taking money, I mean, for the left to take money from the bourgeois state. St. Paul has a phrase for this. It's called making friends out of the mammon of iniquity.
Pigeons, like men, are easily tamed by food. You give a hungry man a job like that, he's going to be less discontent. And it wasn't exactly an evil sort of thing, but a humanitarian sort of thing.
While conservative criticism mounted, artists and writers demonstrated for the right to continue to produce politically partisan art. These pressures from inside and outside presented great difficulties for the project administrators. A diplomatic wizard of sorts maneuvering on two fronts was Henry Alsberg, the director of the Writers' Project.
The head of it was the man who got Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman out of Russia, Henry Alsberg, who was old-time pre-war one liberal anarchist. So that in this period of the attempted Bolshevization of America, he was a kind of anomaly.
In order to get his writers to abandon fashionable proletarian realist styles, Alsberg prescribed exposure to reality. One writer who was sent from Manhattan to explore Staten Island for the Writers' Project was the poet Harry Roskolenko.
When I worked for the Writers' Project of the WPA, I spent about 3 months traveling all over the place just to get some data, some background for the guidebook, the New York State Guidebook.
Roskolenko was a political activist at the time. Like many others, he was convinced that a revolution was just around the corner.
I think I was sailing from Hamburg to New York in 1926, and we got wireless reports about the Patterson strike and the amount of violence there. And of course, like all sailors, you were always thinking of revolution, revolutionary terms, uprising. We were very radicalized. And we thought there would be a revolution certainly starting in New Jersey and just swinging right through the East.
Little of this revolutionary fervor found its way into the fact-filled report on a home for old sailors Roskolenko prepared.
Now, these are actually the notes that I sent in 1936. Sailor Snug Harbor, Richmond Terrace between Tyson Street and Kissel Avenue, a home for retired seamen. Here, the mariners spend their declining days provided with everything from food and shelter to tobacco and movies. To be admitted, a mariner must be 65, an American citizen, and prove that he has been at sea for at least 5 years.
But equally often, the radical writers did sneak their political persuasions into the guidebooks, and for the project administrator, that led to trouble.
You know about what happened in Massachusetts. There was a great to-do there when a reporter discovered that many more lines were devoted to the Sacco and Vanzetti case than were devoted to the Boston Tea Party, twice as many lines. And as a result of that, the governor of the state, Hurley, who had written a letter saying how happy he was that this book was being published about Massachusetts, changed his mind and began to attack the book and attack the project and demanding an investigation, a congressional investigation and whatnot. And the former governor suggested that all the Massachusetts guidebooks be placed in the common and burned. And certain libraries refused to carry the book, and there was a great noise made about it.
It was the unabashed political tendency in the seemingly most innocent work that most annoyed conservatives. The Children's Theater is a good case in point. Traveling all over the country, groups of actors brought theater to millions of young people, most of whom didn't even know what a stage show was.
We had trucks where the side came down and became a platform. The top canvas rolled down and became dressing rooms on either side. You carried your own generator, and you would play for 25,000 people in different parts. So it was a wonderful going to the people theater.
Although children had to be and were entertained, to the actors and directors, children were the revolutionaries of the future. The Revolt of the Beavers, a delightful play and the most successful production of the Children's Theater, illustrates this attitude. The play showed class structures in beaver society, with its robber baron beavers protected by police beavers.
I played a Gestapo kind of beaver. I was tough. We had a team called Rough, Tough, and Gruff. We were all made up like beavers, and it was very exciting. I mean, that's the kind of acting that I would love to do today.
The poor exploited worker beavers are busy planning a revolution to overthrow a government which only represents rich beavers. Of course, the revolution succeeds.
We were accused of being communists, a communist play, because the beavers were stripping the bark off the trees And the Boy Scout troop 248 from the Bronx was supposed to protest this terrible thing that was going on in the state, and the kids loved the play.
More serious political repercussions came with the last black production of the Federal Theater, a play called Haiti, directed by Maurice Clark.
This play was about the struggle of the Negro people in Haiti against an invasion of Napoleon's army. The original script called for a French drawing room, and I changed all that to the big central section of one of these old plantation homes with a winding staircase. I got some drummers from the Congo. And finally, we cast it with some of the leading black actors, like Kenneth Lee and Rex Ingram and some of the prominent people in the Negro theater. It was about equally divided, the white cast and the black cast. And this is as exciting and important to me as the play itself, the whole production itself, was what happened to these actors.
Haiti marked one of the first times in the history of the American professional theater that black and white actors worked together on the same stage.
A whole kind of different relationship started developing. They were laughing together, playing a piano, and instead of just a work relationship, a social relationship developed.
WPA Theater upheld Negro dating here. Project heads encouraged race mixing as part of communism. These headlines played on racist sentiments and used them as a basis for political attack. The one division of the Federal Theater which more than any other attracted left-wing actors and directors was the next to come under fire, the living newspaper.
The great innovation was the living newspaper. We were full of tricks and wheezes, but in fact, nothing that we did was theatrically particularly revolutionary in its essence. The living newspaper was a whole new idea. It was the notion of using the news of the day. It was a sort of a magazine technique for telling a story. The first one they did was Ethiopia. That ended badly. There were protests, and the State Department actually demanded certain changes be made.
There was undoubtedly congressional pressure against what was seen as extreme left-wing influence in the Federal Theater, or at least in some of the Federal Theater, but particularly perhaps in the living newspaper.
After the first show was canceled, Joseph Losey, together with two others, took over. In a new show, they refused to compromise the living newspaper's stark radicalism. After a political showdown with Federal Theater director Hallie Flanagan, Losey opened to great success on Broadway. The play was AAA Plowed Under. It dramatized the problems of the farmers and workers. The farmer gets a few pennies for his milk, while the worker pays a high price for it. The middleman gets rich. Norman Lloyd, now a well-known television actor and director, regularly acted in the living newspaper.
The second play was Injunction Granted. It's interesting, Losey directed that, and Nicholas Ray, who became film director, was the stage manager, and Virgil Thompson did the music. And this was a story of the history of labor in the courts.
I was developing a form which was toward circus, toward vaudeville, using ballet as well as actors' music, mime, and film. Influenced, I suppose, to some extent by Ochlopkov and to some extent by Brecht, and to some extent by the political cabaret, which I'd already done.
I played a clown in that. It was all in pantomime, commenting on the story as it went along, at the various cases, which were acted out in rather black and white terms, but always with the clown commenting, both to illuminate things for the audience and hopefully for humor, and so on.
Again, the opening was postponed, never quite banned. And finally, it came to a showdown. And again, we won, and again, it opened. But it didn't have much chance, and the spirit was gone. And it didn't do as well as the other, although it was more interesting, I think, by far. And it closed. Then I presented various other projects. All of them were turned down, so I resigned. As simple as that.
The closing of the living newspaper was the beginning of the end. Soon John Houseman and myself came under attack. We'd moved from Harlem to Broadway and had formed a new group called Project 891.
The actors we were given were, in one sense, the sort of the dregs of the project. All the other serious projects had already snatched up all the, apparently had snatched up all the conventionally good actors. But Orson had a passion for low comedians and eccentric characters. So in the end, what we got was a very interesting collection of actors. And the first show we did was Horse Eats Hat.
This project produced much controversy and spelled perhaps the end of what could have been a national theater of the United States.
Our next venture was, again, not a classical venture at all, but something that had been brought to us, and we'd heard it and fallen in love with it and decided we wanted to do it. And that was a labor opera, or whatever you want to call it, by Mark Blitzstein called The Cradle Will Rock.
Mark Blitzstein, an admirer of Brecht, wrote words and music for this unique piece. The play was cast with Will Geer and Howard De Silva.
Larry is the organizer, the labor organizer, who's been pulled in with the prostitutes and with street people and so on in a cleanup of the town, along with the powers that be, Mr. and the rest, and who, when the Moll, the whore, asks him what he's doing here, he says, "Who, me?" Why he was pulled in. He says, "Who, me?" Making a speech and passing out leaflets. The formal charge is inciting to riot. Ain't you ever seen my act? When I'm creeping along in the dark, my eyes is crafty, my pockets is bulging. I'm loaded, armed to the teeth with leaflets. And am I quick on the draw? I come up to you very slow, very snaky, and with one fell gesture, I tuck a leaf in your hand. Then 1, 2, 3, there's a riot. I'm the riot. I incited you.
I went to play the original, my old part, which I'd rehearsed with our repertory company of Mr., which is John D. Rockefeller, sort of combined with the head of Republic of Steel. He's the owner of this town, in which all the people are prostitutes to him. The owner of the paper, the doctors and the lawyers, and they're all prostitutes, just as this little girl in the street corner is. The play is very exciting. It has wonderful music, really. Best music Mark Blitzstein wrote.
Cora, we're artists, and we love art for art's sake. It's smart for art's sake, to part for art's sake, with your heart for art's sake, and your mind for art's sake. Be blind for art's sake, and deaf for art's sake, and dumb for art's sake, until for art's sake, they kill for art's sake, all the art for art's sake.
It rehearsed beautifully, and we were all madly in love with what we were doing. Then suddenly, there were a great many steel strikes all over the country, some of which ended in considerable violence. There were other strikes, but this happened to be about steel, so that this was particularly dangerous. And the federal government, or rather the WPA administration, who had to go back to Congress that summer and get new appropriations, because originally they'd only had it for 2 years, and those 2 years were nearly up. So since they had to go to Congress, they were very frightened of producing anything that would create any kind of scandal or any kind of backlash.
The government clamped down on it, refused to have it open. And Howard De Silva and Hiram Sherman and the rest of us had our wigs and costumes snatched away from us. The sets were removed. The theater was padlocked, and the audience itself, who was there for a preview, was thrown out into the streets and began milling around. John Houseman and some very enterprising people like Archibald MacLeish went out to get a theater. And we went out in front, entertained the audience with little snatches of songs and everything I ever knew, from Walt Whitman on through, until they came by in a fire truck And Mark Blitzen had a piano, and the fire people were helping, and they announced they had a theater 20 blocks away, up by the Central Park. And we moved and asked the audience to move with us. They walked with us from 38th Street to 57th Street.
I think the audacity of the whole company, of Will and I, having led the whole company with all of us up the 6th Avenue and having produced it despite the fact that the Federal Theater and Congress had locked us out and closed down the theater, was in itself such an audacious thing. We probably pulled enough of an audience with us along 6th Avenue who were wondering where the hell this audience was walking to uptown.
Oh, the press, the freedom of the press. They'll never take away the freedom of the press. We must be free to say whatever's on our chest. With the hey diddle dee and a ho nonny no, or whichever side will pay the best.
And on the stage, Orson Welles gave a speech. Archibald MacLeish made a nice speech, the poet that's still living today. And John Houseman talked. And Mark came out, they wheeled the piano out with the fireman, and he sat down the piano and began to play it as he did at auditions. And as he got to this first song, the little girl, a Catholic girl and quite reactionary on most subjects, got up suddenly in the box and began to sing.
Maybe you wonder what it is makes people good or bad. Why some guy, an ace without a doubt, turns out to be a bastard, and the other way about. I'll tell you what I feel, it's just the nickel under the heel.
And as we came to each one of the parts, the lawyers and the doctors, Mr. Mr., Mrs. Mr., Junior Mr., and all of them, we all stood up in whatever part of the auditorium we were. We followed the lead of this little girl and sang our songs. And it was a tremendous success, a smash. Everybody got up, stood and cheered. And so before the evening was over, we'd raised enough money to put it on in a regular theater. We moved down the street to the Playhouse Theater on 48th Street. And it went on for a long run with our actors simply sitting on the chairs without any scenery, without any real costumes, and singing along with Mark Blitzen at the piano.
That's thunder, that's lightning, and the line is around you.
The success of The Cradle Will Rock, despite the official ban, brought down the Federal Theater. Before the actors and directors could even register their protest, conservatives mounted such a heavy attack on Washington that Roosevelt was forced to appease them with drastic measures.
What Roosevelt had done was to decide that in order to stop this red-baiting attack against him, he would allow the Federal Theater to be dissolved. Of course, it gained nothing because they went right on and dissolved everything else. This was the beginning of a whole new history in the United States.
I think if
you can answer that, can't you?
Writers, actors, and artists alike had poked fun at Martin Dies and his committee. Now his hour had come. In hearings broadcast nationwide, Dies' House on Un-American Activities Committee investigated hundreds of artists and intellectuals, branding them subversive and un-American.
The only way that we can defeat their aims and purposes is to expose them before they strike.
And in one stroke of the pen, this whole thing was destroyed. I went down to my office, which was down in the 20s and about 20th and Broadway, down in that area. We had 2 floors of offices there for the Federal Theater. I went to go up to my office, and they had sent in workmen with hammers to destroy our offices, which were partitions built in this large loft-type building. And believe it or not, these men were taking joy in what they were doing. They were swinging their axes and the hammers, and they were not only breaking up these partitions, they were splintering them. And I found my desk under a whole pile of of broken boards and dug in there to get out what records I could salvage. That's how the Federal Theater went.
Attacks on the project mounted daily. The next concession hit the Writers' Project. Control was transferred to the individual states, while responsibility for publications remained in Washington. The doors were open for censorship.
We had one of our best books was censored. The Washington office absolutely refused to publish it. That was a history of civil liberties in the state of Illinois. It was done under the supervision of Marion Knobloch, who's since then been a leader in the Chicago Civil Liberties Committee. And finally, it was published by the Civil Liberties Union with no mention whatever of the Writers' Project, all the work that was done over a period of several years.
All right. There's a chapter on censorship. There's a chapter on rights of aliens, and that was a very sad chapter during World War I in Illinois. There's a chapter called Rights of Political Minorities, and the rights of labor, and so forth. Rights of the unemployed, or did I mention that before? Unconstitutional police methods. You see, these were all, and anti-Semitism.
And it's a very factual account. Nothing controversial. They were just afraid that their congressional and journalistic critics would descend on them, so they weren't going to take a chance. And they just said, no, you're not going to publish it.
So they sent 2 people out from Washington, investigators. And they came to the project. They interviewed almost everybody but me. And then they did tell me that it was a good book, and they wanted it to be published, only there were a few little places that needed to be toned down.
In the Federal Arts Project, the most violent attacks were those provoked by these paintings in Coit Tower on San Francisco's Telegraph Hill, especially Bernard Sackheim's mural, Library. It shows a worker taking a volume of Karl Marx down from the bookshelf. But still, the artist felt ready to fight. In some of the newspaper headlines he painted, Sackheim commented on the attacks leveled against his work. Later, when the rumor spread that the whole arts project was to be axed, intellectuals and artists mounted protests, but often in terms which only gave more ammunition to their conservative enemies.
As this issue of the New Anvil goes to press, the Federal Arts Project, which have rendered invaluable service in bringing culture to the people, are threatened by the onslaught of Tories, who would either abolish these projects altogether or seriously hamper their effectiveness by drastic curtailments and strangling restrictions. No section of the Works Progress Administration has justified its existence more than the Cultural Project. The efforts to destroy them remind one forcibly of the words of a Nazi arbiter of public taste. When I hear the word culture, I cock my rifle.
But it wasn't only the political statements by theater people, artists, and painters that antagonized conservatives. It was also the appeal to reform of the FSA photographs.
That this came in, there were concerted efforts to try to get rid of this organization. And it was called, and I don't think it was ever called communistic, but it was not considered by some people as being too desirable.
At first, we weren't noticed much, but congressmen, being politicians, always look for something to criticize if they can, and I happened to become a controversial figure for other reasons by that time, and so we were pretty liberally attacked by the politicians.
For a while, the FSA photographers managed to stave off their critics by making some pretty pictures, but it was of little use in the long run. Soon, the FSA photographers were no longer documenting daily life in America. Instead, They would record the life in the armed forces. In 1940, the FSA photography section was transferred to OWI, the Office of War Information. All their pictures, over 300,000, are preserved in the Library of Congress. A whole decade of American history is stored and cataloged here. It is the best organized and publicly accessible visual record of the 1930s. Unfortunately, there were no archives for the work of painters and designers. In the 30s, James Brooks, now a well-known abstract expressionist, painted a mural for New York's LaGuardia Airport.
I heard from a friend, he was a director of the Boston Museum when he was down visiting a friend, that he had come through the terminal on the way down and there was nothing on the walls anymore. And he wondered what happened. I didn't know. So I asked, and I heard that it had just been painted out without asking anyone by the Port Authority, who had recently taken over the building. The Marine Terminal was the building that I did a circular mural in that circumscribed the lobby 10 feet up from the floor, 10 and a half feet up from the floor, and the height of the mural actually was 12 feet, 3 inches by 235 feet. It was a rather complex job. It's about the idea of flight. It starts with man's thoughts about flight, and this is an early man being oppressed by the nature and wondering what it's all about and where the lightning comes from. And then here's a modern man and a woman welcoming the plane with the shadow of the plane coming across her and the compass there.
Today, no trace is left of Brooks' gigantic mural. It is painted over in institutional green. The fear and suspicion of the post-war years left no place for muralist social criticism and political art. Hundreds of murals and thousands of easel paintings and posters were simply lost or destroyed.
How the Arts Project died, of course, is part of history, if you know about. The primitives took over, the Neanderthals took over. It's simple as that. By the way, we say right one or beat left. That doesn't mean, I think the idea of Neanderthalism took over. Not just anti-intellectual, it's contempt for working people, too.
Our committee is the only agency of government that has the power of exposure. Therefore, this investigation must go on without fear or favor, and our slogan must be, no quarter to the enemies of our country.
The ending of the Federal Arts Project, or WPA itself, is also a diminishing of the vision of possibilities. And I think this is one of the horrors, aside from making the young ignorant of history, particularly of labor, but also making us zombies in a sense. And of course, it's not accidental that, well, the war, of course, happened, the mobilization occurred, but within the hot war itself against fascism, the seeds of the Cold War were being sown.
I used to write under different names, like everybody did. True Confessions, Boston's True Confessions was started here in Minneapolis. So you used to try and write a true confession under a different name. And I wrote for women's magazines under a different name. I had about 4 or 5 names. I get a job waiting on tables, and in a week, the boss would come and say, I'm sorry, you know, but the FBI has been here.
Ironically and sadly, after the war, many people were punished for their involvement. They were investigated by the Un-American Activities Committee by Senator McCarthy and the FBI. Not only their work was destroyed, but the very memory they stood for was obliterated. The WPA and its arts projects blossomed for merely 3 or 4 years. Then they fell victim to powerful forces: conservatism, the war, the prosperity of the post-war years. But despite their sudden and tragic demise, these projects left us an important cultural legacy. The New Deal left us a belief in ordinary people, in older American values, in a truly popular American culture. The artists of the 30s gave a shape, a vision, a form to the period. They bestowed on us the gift of memory, of our people, our places, and ourselves.
I saw an honest farmer, his back was bending low, picking out his cotton, he couldn't hardly go. He tied it up in a rail fence until the merchant come, that he might take his cotton, that he might give them some. Goodbye, boll weevil, for you know you ruined my home. You know you've got my cotton, and the merchant's got my corn. I saw him in the summer, 'twas hot as it could be, strolling through the harvest field, the sweat was running free.